When it comes to Trumpnomics, it's just a lateral move from Obamanomics. You can't get away from it, if you're going to be honest. Intellectually so, certainly. And the bottom line is Trump's big government spending plans are a repeat of past mistakes. In other words, the continuance of business as usual inside the Beltway. David Leach starts off this part of the program. Albert Einstein is credited with saying that we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. When it comes to the federal budget and America's unsustainable national debt, Uncle Albert could have been talking about Washington, D.C. Donald Trump has begun making a major push to drum up support for his trillion with a T dollar infrastructure spending spree. In other words, his huger version of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and a so-called tax reform package in order to boost the economy, much like Obama claimed to boost the economy in his first term. Of course, we know from experience that such schemes always fall short of expectations. We need look no further than the past two administrations and the $1.5 trillion in total government spending by Bush and Obama to save the free market system and create shovel-ready jobs that weren't as shovel-ready as we expected. You may have heard, this just in case you haven't, that our current national debt is nearly 20 trillion with a T dollars. This amounts to $61,000 for every man, woman, and child living in America. I mean, each, not per family, each one of us. Over $158,000 for every household in America. 106% of the U.S. gross domestic product. And 560% of the annual gross federal revenue. 3 years ago, I forget who it was who was testifying on Capitol Hill before a Senate committee, but 3 years ago, this witness said, America is Greece. America is already broke. You just don't know it yet. It's like the analogy I've used for several years now about how a chicken runs around madly after its head has been chopped off. And eventually it falls over dead. That's the condition America is in, thanks to Barack Obama, and now Donald Trump wants to make it worse. It's frightening, but that doesn't include an additional $70 trillion in unfunded liabilities for Social Security and Medicare. 70 trillion with a T. I harken back to that quote from an episode of The Universe on the History Channel. In the context of astronomy, Alex Filippenko said something along the lines of numbers, or maybe it was Clifford Johnson of USC, one of the two, that once you get into numbers like millions and billions and trillions, they really become hard to understand, to get your mind around, because most of us, hell, all of us, or rather none of us, have ever had billions, billions, or trillions of anything. It's just, it becomes an abstraction. $70 trillion, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, to put that into some perspective, that is what? 5 years? 4 years, 5 years of total everything, American gross domestic product? In other words, If the entire gross domestic product of the United States went to nothing else, in other words, your money, my money, everybody's money was confiscated by the government, and everything we worked for, every dollar earned, every sale made, whatever, all that money went to the government, and somehow the economy continued to function, which it wouldn't. But if it did, if by some miracle economic incentives and those dynamics were suspended, that would have to go on for 4 or 5 years in order to fund those currently unfunded liabilities. The future value, or rather the present value of future benefits. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare, Trump care if it passes. Add to that scenario, to the scenario, and America's actual debt is nearly $91 trillion. I've seen it quoted as high as $222 trillion. It boggles the mind. It just ceases to be real, but it's going to be real when the collapse comes. We don't know when that's going to be, but when it happens, none of us, even those centenarians, octogenarians, nonagenarians, centenarians who lived through the Great Depression of the 1930s, even they have no clue about what it's going to be like. I mean, just imagine nothing. Total societal collapse. No food, no infrastructure, no power, no nothing. The things you depend on. Electricity coming out of those little rectangles in the wall. Gasoline, paying, getting money out of an ATM. Paying with your debit card. Writing a check. Nothing. Everything gone. Unprecedented. And I'm saying this as someone who, I'm in the same boat. I don't know what it's going to be like. I mean, it's the kind of thing where when you start thinking about it, you stop because you don't want to think about it, frankly. So why isn't Trump looking for ways to stop this insanity instead of trying to find new ways to spend money we don't have? Well, because he's Trump. And because, like the monsters that dwell in the swamp he promised to drain but isn't, he is more concerned with taking care of the status quo in Washington than he is about doing what's best for America's future, because that's what's best for him. He's not going to drain anything. He joined it. In his mind, he's the king of the swamp now. You think he's going to drain it? As corrupt as he is, and shallow and venal and vain. Trump loves big government. He always has. He's said so for years. And he has stated how he plans to use his infrastructure spending scheme as a tool to please the Democrats. What did we never Trumpers warn you people about the past couple of years? I'll say it again. Trump has stated how he plans to use his infrastructure spending scheme as a tool to please the Democrats. Nancy Pelosi's already on board with it. And his so-called tax reform plan will be designed to please Republicans, except it won't be pleasing to Republicans. It'll be a lot more pleasing to Democrats as well. By the way, I use the word so-called when referring to Trump's tax reform plan because even though he's proposing tax cuts for many Americans, he's a big fan of the 20% border adjustment tax. Think Smoot-Hawley tariff, ladies and gentlemen, on imports from non-U.S. based businesses. If the tax reform includes the border adjustment tax, any reduction in income tax rates will be lost due to the higher prices consumers will have to pay for goods and services. In other words, bleep Walmart. There will be no Walmart to go to get things at a lower price. Forget Winco Foods, grocery co-ops, any grocery outlet. Forget all that. Everything's going to cost as much, if not more, than Safeway. Premium. Because of this border adjustment tax. This is what protectionism, this is what tariff barriers do. They drive up prices and destroy jobs. Because businesses can't print money. They have to earn their income, their revenue streams. Congressman Ken Buck calls out-of-control spending a bipartisan problem that few in Washington have the balls to address honestly, and upcoming budget discussions will sadly prove how true that really is. Trump's big government promises will tickle the ears of the Trump chorus line, but the result will be more of the same budget-busting, big government deficit spending we've seen in the past, and which, supposedly, we could no longer afford. And as Albert Einstein so perfectly proclaimed, that's not how to solve the problem. Here's a delightful headline at Red State. Trump's earlier claims of eliminating the debt now gently referred to as hyperbole. Or, as we've come to know it on the Hard Starver radio channel, bullshit! 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 Bullshit!
You're not telling the reason they're playing.
Bullshit! Let's go bullshit! Some folks would call it a lie. That would include us. We know the national debt situation is massive. We're in hock to red China and other for overseas creditors. So deep, it's not likely most reading this will see any relief from it in our lifetime. In fact, I can guarantee it. Donald Trump, however, with his usual Duane, Elizondo, Mountain Dew, Camacho bravado, has promised to cancel the debt by the end of his second term. That's an interesting choice of words. Cancel? You mean default? Because they ain't going to be paid back. Does he have a secret weapon or something? No. See the immediately preceding cutaway. First of all, he wasn't even in office and had no clue to the extent of debt or how government operates when he made that statement. Then there's the Office of Management and Budget Director Mick Mulvaney, who basically said not to listen to Trump because he's full of shit. Asked on Wednesday about Trump's promise to end the debt, Mulvaney said, quote, from thehill.com, "It's fairly safe to assume that was hyperbole." In other words, bullshit. Mulvaney responded, "I'm not going to be able to pay off $20 trillion worth of debt in 4 years. I'd be being dishonest with you if I said I could." Which feeds the notion that he's not talking about paying it back or paying it down. He's talking about default. Reneging on it. The reason the president doesn't want to change some of the mandatory spending is because the public's not ready for it yet. They're ready for economic growth. Well, yeah, but, close quote, but you see, this is what Trumpers are trying to do. They're trying to wildly, desperately, frantically move the goalposts as far and as wide as they need to in order to try to make Trump not look like the con artist that took them, that swindled them, that bilked them, that skinned them alive, that humiliated them, that made dupes and fools out of them. That's exactly what he's done. Anything they have to do to make Trump not look like the liar he is. I mean, nobody's going to pay back. It's never going to be paid back, first of all. Second of all, that's why I think he means default. Just, oh, we're not going to pay anymore. Sorry. Although he would save that for when he was either about to lose his re-election bid in 2020 or in 2024, if he did get reelected. That's when Trump would do that. When it wouldn't be on his back. Wouldn't be part of his legacy anymore. So Trump is writing checks that Mulvaney's ass can't cash. To begin chipping away at that national debt, it would require some major belt tightening on the part of the federal government. To get both sides of the aisle to give up some of their pet projects, and the pet is porcine in nature, just to be clear, won't allow for that to happen because it's just not enough. Look at what Mulvaney said here. President doesn't want to change some of the mandatory spending, and that's because the public's not ready for it yet. Well, they're bloody well going to have to be told that. That was the whole idea behind Donald Trump. Donald Trump was not a professional politician. He was an outsider. Donald Trump tells it like it is. He was going to do things that nobody else could do. Well, if you're going to get the national debt problem under control, guess what has to happen? You have to privatize entitlements. Privatize Social Security, privatize Medicare, privatize Medicaid, get government out of entitlements. No more entitlement programs. That's what it takes. That's what it's going to take. Because entitlement programs are what are driving the national debt. Eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse, which can't be eliminated in big government circumstances in any case. But even if you could, that doesn't make even the slightest dent in the deficit, much less the debt itself. The same thing with, we'll cut off foreign aid, because people think foreign aid is half the federal budget. Well, it's not. What they call euphemistically transfer payments are more than half of the federal budget by this time. You've got to target entitlements. Donald Trump, I mean, he was wielding the sledgehammer. He was the bull in the china shop. He would do what nobody else had the balls to do because he was an outsider. He was not a professional politician. He was a businessman. And now, well, Donald Trump doesn't want to change some of the mandatory spending because the public's not ready for it yet. Well, he doesn't have that luxury. He did not give himself that latitude. Sorry. If you wanted somebody who wasn't a professional politician, who was an outsider, who told it like it was, who had the balls, the strength, and that was supposedly Donald Trump, then Donald Trump had to come in and take a sledgehammer to entitlement programs. Period. Because that's what has to be done if the collapse, capital C, is to be averted. That's not what he's doing, is it? However, even if Trump knew he was lying when he said he'd pay off the debt in 8 years, or even Trump knew he was lying, and so did anybody who wasn't a MAGA maniac knew it too. Last year it was 8 years, but in the follow-up he adjusted those remarks. Quote, I didn't say 10 years. First of all, with low interest rates, you can think in terms of refinancings and get it down, Trump said in April of 2016. I believe you can do certain things to pay off the debt more quickly. The most important thing is to make sure the economy stays strong. You can do it in smaller chunks. You can do it in larger chunks. And you can do it in refinancing. He instead said he could pay off a percentage of it in 10 years. Well, first of all, you have to run annual surpluses to begin doing that. And that's not where the budget is right now. And Trump, $1 trillion infrastructure boondoggle, that all by itself that's not going to lead to balanced budgets. Where's the sledgehammer? Where's the bull in the china shop? Where's the budget berserker who was going to eliminate whole cabinet level departments? which actually he never promised to do. That was just, well, and his supporters don't even want that, do they? But Donald Trump was going to supposedly do what no professional politician could do. Apparently not. It's like we told you. And what is that percentage? 50%, 12%, 1%? Try 0. I promise you, he does not have a clue, and he could care less. Perhaps Trumpnomics can be best symbolized by Peter Navarro, Trump's nutty economics professor. As you can probably already discern, this is another Kevin Williamson gem. You see, Trump would do well to ignore his advisor's advice on Red China, but then that's not why Trump appointed him, is it? In the collected works of Peter Navarro, there is a peculiar paradox. Some of the dullest prose imaginable challenges the sharp edge of Hanlon's razor, the aphorism that advises us, never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity. Professor Navarro of the University of California at Irvine has hanging on the wall of an office or a den somewhere a doctorate in economics from Harvard. Barring some Forrest Gump-level chain of coincidence, it does not seem likely that anything as innocent as stupidity explains his literary output, which consists of a few how to make money in the stock market books. An actual title is If It's Raining in Brazil by Starbucks. From earlier in his career, and a half dozen or so low-minded books about Red China with such talk radio-ready names as Death by China and The Coming China Wars. 2 books that contain 80 exclamation points between them, as well as several pamphlets summarizing the main points of his books. He is Donald Trump's House China intellectual, the only one of his close advisors who was a credentialed academic economist, albeit one whose area of specialty is utility companies, not international trade. Our most famous scholar of trade economics, Paul Krugman, apparently was not available for service in the Trump administration. Pity, because that would be more honest. Navarro has been named head of the newly created National Trade Council. Note, newly created. Government getting bigger, not smaller. A position in which he is well positioned to do a great deal of damage to the Trump administration, to the United States and its economic interests, and, yes, the global economy. That's quite a step up for a man who was teaching undergraduate econ to business students until a few months ago. Now, it will not escape your notice that his career bears far more than a passing resemblance to that of Elizabeth Pocahontas Warren, the senior senator from Massachusetts. Democrat, goes without saying. Both entered public life as academics. Both attempted to build fortunes and reputations on popular financial self-help books. Elizabeth Warren offered the David Ramsey-ish ultimate lifetime money plan. Warren, possibly owing to her being a woman of color, that would be Pantone code 11-0602 TPX. Secured a more prestigious academic appointment than he did, but UC Irvine isn't nothing. Both individuals were instrumental in the creation of federal agencies, though Warren ultimately was prevented from leading the Consumer Financial Victimization Bureau she dreamt up. Both sought public office, with Warren coming to serve in the Senate and Navarro running for office 4 times as a Democrat, losing races for mayor of San Diego City Council, county supervisor, and California's 49th congressional district. That's down in the Gibbs pocket, I believe. Both have a taste for populist, read leftist, arguments against international trade, and both have made environmental concerns a prominent part of their anti-trade positions. Writes Navarro in one quote, Vice President and Nobel laureate Al Gore has been transformed from it by an avalanche of scientific facts? No. From a left-wing crazy to the planet's most authoritative political voice on the subject. This comes from the head of Trump's National Trade Council, ladies and gentlemen. And it goes without saying, both are battier than Bruce Wayne's basement. Now, Professor Navarro, among other things, makes economics errors that would be obvious to an undergraduate. This has been commented on elsewhere, most prominently after he published a review of the economic plan. Think about that. Economic plan? Central planning? A review co-authored with Wilbur Ross, who is not an economist but is now Secretary of Commerce, in which he pro-offered the schoolboy argument that because gross domestic product is defined as the sum of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, eliminating our trade deficit with Red China would add substantially to GDP. In economics terms, he has mistaken an accounting identity for real-world causality. In layman's terms, this is horsepucky, to clean up a phrase. A mistake that an econ professor like him really should not be making, as Noah Smith of Bloomberg pointed out. Net exports means exports minus imports. And because the United States currently runs a trade deficit, and has for decades, that figure is negative. And it is not a trivial figure. Our trade deficit with Red China in 2016 equaled about 2% of GDP. But eliminating that trade deficit would not add 2% to gross domestic product. Imports are subtracted from the GDP model because they already are counted in other consumption, and we don't want to double count them. As Cato Institute, Dan Eichenson puts it in his savage write-up of Navarro's economic illiteracy, his words, in The Hill, quote, imports have nothing to do with gross domestic product, other than the fact that they increase when the economy is growing and they tend to decrease when the economy is contracting. There is no inverse relationship between imports and gross domestic product, as Navarro asserts. He calls Navarro's appointment an assault on the fundamental premise that public policy should be rooted in fact and reason. You know, I mentioned he's an environmentalist too. An environmentalist wacko. An Al Gore fanboy. The deficits in trade are married to surpluses in investment. Why do foreign economic actors want to invest here? Because it's a good place to put their money, so the perception is. Second largest economy in the world after Red China. That happened under Barack Obama, by the way, just so you know. The Chinese, the Chi-Coms, choose to consume less and invest more for many reasons. One is that Red China is still poor and does not wish to be, and its leaders understand that real prosperity does not come without real investment. Another is that any Chinese national with the wherewithal to invest outside of Red China is smart enough to know that doing so is prudent when you live under a police state that is by necessity always one serious economic crisis away from civil unrest. Professor Navarro never gives any serious consideration to the actual fact of trade-offs, because consumption and investment, trade-offs being the coin of the realm for economists doing economics. For him, trade is mainly a moral question. He's a liberal, folks. Here's a quote from Navarro. While China's unfair trading practices constitute the major reason the United States runs huge trade deficits with China, these unfair practices are not the only reason. At least part of America's huge trade imbalance problem may be traced directly to its nearly decade-long descent into a living beyond one's means lifestyle. Remember when Barack Obama said, at some point you made enough money. This is a lifestyle that has been accommodated by both chronic federal budget deficits and a surfeit of easy money from the Federal Reserve's printing press, both of which were staples of Obamanomics that Trump wants to continue. You know, it's just not true that Navarro's recent claim that China effectively acts as the United States central banker, as he repeatedly puts it. A little less than half of U.S. government debt held by the public is owned by foreign governments and institutions, and Red China is not the biggest overseas holder of that debt. Japan is, as of the most recent, this past December, figures from the Treasury Department. The third biggest holder of U.S. federal debt abroad is Ireland, followed by, see if you can identify the trend here, think tax havens, the Cayman Islands, Brazil, Switzerland, Luxembourg, and the United Kingdom. The belief that Beijing has some special hold on U.S. finances is an exaggeration. To the extent that there is a stranglehold, it is mutual. Luo Ping, then Red China's top bank regulator, told an audience of American financiers and regulators in 2009, quote, "Except for U.S. treasuries, what can you hold? Gold? You don't hold Japanese government bonds or British bonds. We know the dollar is going to depreciate, so we hate you guys, but there is nothing much we can do." Close quote. He wasn't wrong about that. And the prospect of Red China firebombing its own assets in a fit of anti-American pique is far-fetched. Professor Navarro almost certainly knows this. Professor Navarro almost certainly doesn't care. His fearful books and risible, meaning absurd, for those of you in Marietta, California, policy analyses are not written for the Dan Eikensons of the world, or even for those freshman econ students who could spot the errors in his work. They are written for partisans and true believers. I've seen them, folks. I see them every day. This is a very large audience, Sean Hannity's audience, to be specific. But Navarro's most recent policy analysis was written for the smallest of all possible audiences and the smallest of all brains, an audience of one, Donald J. Trump. Navarro's China books are also written to stir emotion, not light, which is consistent with his liberalism. He refers to Diego Garcia as one of the most strategic bases in the American matrix, a phrase that is without functional meaning. Vetoing panda proliferates genocide in Darfur, on the other hand, is worthy of Lawrence Ferlinghetti. Navarro offers absurd historical quantifications such as this gem. Across a broad swath of world history, in fully 11 of the 15 times since 1500 that a rising power like China faced an established power like the United States, war resulted more than 70% of the time. Whatever that means. I mean, is there a common context? Not really. He's very, very fond of that broad swath, sweep, whatever. For example, it should be clear from this broad sweep of history that since taking power in 1949, the Chinese Communist Party has consistently engaged in repeated acts of aggression and violence over a period spanning more than 6 decades. Well figured again. When you juxtapose this Chinese history against that of America's own exceedingly violent modern record, this is indeed a highly combustible mix. Gee, one hears in that some echoes of Trump's defense of Vladimir Putin's murders and suppression. We've got a lot of killers. What do you think our country? What do you think our country is so innocent? Navarro's policy prescriptions are fanciful and, again, liberally moralistic. Question whether you really need what you were about to buy from China. I guarantee people don't go to Walmart to think, what can I buy that was manufactured in China? They get stuff because it's economical, because they can afford it, because it's lower priced. And Navarro falls into the familiar academic's conceit of believing that he knows a great deal more about other people's businesses than do those people themselves, the ones who run them. For example, I always marvel at this lemming-like offshoring behavior. In the parlance of business strategy, these executives have failed miserably in performing a complete risk assessment of moving their facilities to China. Close quote. In an earlier life, Kevin Williamson was involved in corporate risk assessment, which is much more granular. One of his chores was counting up the number of ransom kidnappings in Santo Domingo. Then the grand sweep of Professor Navarro's point of view. The brain trust in Cupertino almost certainly has given a lot more thought and genuine study to Apple's vulnerabilities vis-a-vis China than Peter Navarro has. Why? Because he has no financial stake in it. If he did, he'd have some motivation to actually get it right. I should probably mention the plagiarism. So far as I can see, Professor Navarro does not copy the work of others word for word, except for an unattributed quotation from Toby Keith, but his work sometimes relies heavily on uncredited sources. For example, in a section on Chinese-made counterfeit goods, he asks the reader to consider a number of scenarios. Developing a rash from using fake Head and Shoulders shampoo made with an irritating ingredient, having one's fire alarm system destroyed by fake Duracell batteries, having a reaction from fake Viagra. What kind of reaction would you get from fake Viagra if it wasn't the one you were going for? Etc., etc., etc. Those name brand examples appear in a piece by ABC News that is substantially similar to Navarro's context, as well as in an earlier Chicago Tribune report. If one of my undergraduate students had turned in a similar piece of work, I would have flunked them for it. But this is part of Professor Navarro's throw it all and see what sticks approach. It leads him to some strange places, such as suggesting that Red China is likely to dissolve into a state of internal chaos, and that one of the possible triggers is an HIV pandemic, no doubt seeded by the evil CIA. He refers to this possibility as China's ticking HIV/AIDS time bomb in the coming China wars, as aforementioned. In reality, China has an HIV infection rate less than 1/30th that of the District of Columbia. HIV is an issue in China, as it is almost everywhere, but it is a minor one, even in comparison with more advanced countries such as the United Kingdom. Professor Navarro merrily ignores the entire context because it would get in the way of making the point he's trying to make. Propaganda, my friends. His sloppiness with sources is general and systemic. Navarro cites a Rand Corporation report suggesting that China is behind Iran's nuclear program. In fact, it was Obama. Without mentioning that the report is a quarter-century old, that it identifies China as a moderate threat to U.S. interests, or that subsequent RAND analysis suggests that Chinese involvement with Iranian nuclear ambitions seems to have ended around 1997, although just this week a story came out indicating that it may have resumed. He does not even cite any particular RAND report, simply attributing a long quotation to the RAND Corporation. Professor Navarro does not have much of an eye for the future, which is a problem for a man in the futurism business. He foresees American streets clogged with shoddy Chinese-made cars. Here's the quote. Pulling out of a gas station back into traffic, you were horrified to see a sporty little compact car made in Shanghai scream through a red light and plow directly into a school bus when the car's counterfeit brake pads fail. Of course, if it's a shoddy little compact car made in Shanghai, why would it do all that much damage to the bus compared to like if it had been T-boned by an SUV? Fortunately, none of the children are badly hurt, but the driver winds up in the morgue after the front end of his made-in-China car crumples because of its low-quality steel and the driver's side airbag failing to deploy. Close quote. There are a few Chinese-made cars for sale in the United States. Volvo, for instance, makes some cars there. They don't fit that description. Their bumpers are pretty good. Trump fretted that China is maneuvering to control the world's oil supply and that a partnership between Beijing and Caracas, this was while Hugo Chavez was still running the show, threatened to starve the United States of oil. Of course, since then, the United States has become a petroleum exporter, and as I write, the oil men in Houston are watching queasily as the price of crude drops below $50 a barrel because of an oil glut. As a wise man once said, it is difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. But Professor Navarro does not seem to understand the present very well either. In fact, his understanding of the Chinese authorities' economic strategy is exactly backward. He argues that Beijing intentionally maintains an artificially high unemployment rate in order to coerce workers into accepting wages that are low and stagnant. In reality, Chinese workers' wages have been rising from 5 to 7% per year, or more by some estimates, for years. Of course, they were starting from basically zero, so they had plenty of room to grow. While unemployment has been relatively low. As unemployment has increased in recent years, Beijing has gone to great lengths to convince the Chinese people that the labor market is tighter than it in fact is. Beijing knows that an army of unemployed men is an army that it must take seriously. Think Tiananmen Square. Far from using the threat of unemployment to motivate workers, the powers that be in China fear a general sense of job insecurity more than they fear anything else short of an invading army. And one could go on, but there would be no point. Trump feels the need for occasional intellectual window dressing. Consider his endless references to the academic high flyers in his family and his recent boast that we have, by far, the highest IQ of any cabinet ever assembled. But he is, in fact, deeply anti-intellectual, and remember, shallow as the kiddie pool at Munchkin Land, which is one of the reasons he prefers to be advised by cranks and fast food titans instead of, say, people who actually know what they're talking about, with the apparent exception of James Mattis and H.R. McMaster. Professor Navarro is, as I understand it, an excellent scholar of utilities. He does not have any special competence on the subject of China, on the economics of trade, or on American trade policy at all. He is a crude and ridiculous propagandist, one with a federal portfolio, and of course, a place of honor in the Trump regime. When, Daniel Horowitz asks at Conservative Review, did Donald Trump start embracing Obamacare's illegal subsidies? Answer, from day one. The Trumplican Party has become one giant scam pack. When they are out of power, they boldly declare Democrat policies to be illegal and unconstitutional, yet when they get into power, they continue the same policies. This is the Trump influence, folks. We've already seen this with the Iran nuclear sellout and Obama's executive amnesty, the Immigration Proclamation, which are still being recognized and enforced by the Trump administration. Now we are facing the same dilemma with the illegal cost-sharing subsidies for Obamacare. It's one thing to phase out harmful policies over time, but when it comes to illegal executive actions, how can they continue administering them for even one day? Because it's Trump. Obamacare's regulations are so crippling and actuarially insolvent that the individual mandate and the open needed subsidies given to consumers have done nothing to fix the health care problem. In fact, they have only further distorted the market and increased prices. To that end, the Obama regime, in one of the most lawless decisions of a lawless presidency, decided to create an additional layer of subsidies outside of statute, Article 1, Section 1, ladies and gentlemen, to be given directly to insurers. Bailouts, in other words. One of those subsidies, referred to as cost-sharing reductions, reimbursed insurers for discounting co-payments and deductibles for low-income enrollees. The premiums were subsidized by the main Obamacare payouts. The problem with this program, aside from further inflating the cost for those who aren't subsidized, is that it's completely unconstitutional. The Obama administration paid insurers billions of dollars outside of an appropriation from Congress. CBO projects that under current policy, this illegal program will cost $130 billion over 10 years. This was not a law. This was an executive decree. Last year in House versus Burwell, the GOP-led House sued Obama for creating his own slush fund without Congress. In a rare victory and through the prism of a legitimate exercise of judicial power, interpreting instead of nullifying a statute, Judge Rosemary Collyer sided with House Republicans in asserting that the cost-sharing subsidies were appropriated without consent of Congress. In other words, they weren't appropriated. They were just imposed by executive diktat. One would expect that the minute Tom Price took over Health and Human Services, itself an unconstitutional department, the unconstitutional subsidies would vanish immediately. You don't need Congress to do that. You just rescind the illegal executive order, period. Signing ceremony for Trump. Everybody's happy. One would also expect Trump's lawyers to immediately drop the previous regime's appeal to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit regarding the constitutionality of those subsidies, right? The Trump regime has declined to drop the appeal of the district court's ruling because, of course, now it's Trump that has all that power, and he's not going to voluntarily get rid of any powers that Barack Obama bequeathed him. And is, in fact, continuing to offer the illegal subsidies. Thus, what Republicans universally regarded as unconstitutional when they were out of power, Trumplicans are now administering. Much like they are illegally handing out work permits to illegal aliens amnestied under Obama. Now, some might suggest that Trump is in a lose-lose situation because now that Obamacare is the law of the land, well, it's unconstitutional, Even more states will be without any insurers if he shuts off the subsidies. This is the excuse that you get from Trumpers these days. Trump himself recognized this predicament in an interview with the Wall Street Journal. The president said that on the one hand, he'd love to see the law collapse, but he fears he would be blamed for the collapse instead of the supporters of Obamacare, except he is a supporter of Obamacare de facto. Even though he didn't shut off the spigot immediately, he is entertaining the idea of threatening to suspend the cost sharing as a means of getting the Democrats to the table. What did Never Trumpers say? What have we been saying for the past almost 2 years? Trump is not going to make deals with the party he already conquered. He's going to make deals with Democrats. See, this is a false dichotomy. Trump needs to realize, and which means he won't, that there is a third option, actually repealing Obamacare and demanding that Republicans support him. But he's not doing that, is he? As leader of the party, rather than bully conservatives into supporting Trump care, he should demand that liberal Republicans get with the program and fully repeal the law and actually solve the health care problem. At that point, there wouldn't be a need for the illegal subsidies, and in fact, they would only further distort the market. Democrats will never have an incentive at this point to buy into any GOP bill. There is only one option if the repeal of Obamacare is what you seek. Donald Trump could harness his populist, meaning leftist, so it doesn't even apply here, appeal against big government, and of course populism is for big government. The only difference between Trumplicans and Democrats is the identity of the groups that are the primary recipients of federal largesse. That's really the only difference. Trump could harness these populist appeal against, but his appeal is for big government, not against it, and the healthcare industry by immediately suspending the kickbacks for insurers. It is hard to anticipate the actions of the private sector, but by repealing the coverage mandates of Obamacare with a reasonable transition period, and concurrently making it clear that all subsidies and kickbacks were permanently terminated, insurance companies would have no more wiggle room other than to utilize the deregulation to offer a multitude of market-based plans, including catastrophic and limited benefit plans. They would be forced to compete for consumer demand rather than have a monopoly over the small trough of regulated and subsidized plans. Trump's message could be unambiguous. We will not regulate you, and we will not subsidize you. Go out and compete for consumer demand. Then he could travel the country and rail against a crony socialist healthcare system that looks like a grocery shelf in Venezuela instead of one in America. He could demand that liberal Republicans get on board with a full repeal of Obamacare or risk violating one of his core campaign promises. Could. Unfortunately, as we are seeing with an array of domestic and foreign policy, domestic issues anyway, New York Democrats are pushing Trump in the other direction. Noted healthcare expert Ivanka Trump, as well as President Kushner and Gary Cohn, are reportedly pushing to keep the subsidies. While Steve Bannon is arguing that, no, Steve Bannon is just wanting to get the booty, the spoils for the alt-right. Liberal congressional Republicans such as Tom Cole and Lamar Alexander are also pushing for a continuation of the subsidies because they're weak. Sensing blood in the water, Democrats are now demanding that the subsidies be codified by Congress in the budget bill, backfilling for their Messiah. Now that Democrats successfully jettisoned all conservative writers from the budget, why not go on offense and demand their priorities? After all, we can't have a government shutdown. Now, instead of the battle lines over the budget being drawn over defunding refugee resettlement, Planned Parenthood, we must play defense on the cost-sharing subsidies. All of it thanks to Donald J. Trump. I tell you, if he's not an agent of sabotage for the other side, he may as well be. Caving on principle begets more capitulation. Of course, Donald Trump's only principle is look out for number one. That he will never cave on. There is no way to get around not repealing Obamacare, but somehow pretending we are repealing it. The path forward is and always was very simple. Full repeal of Obamacare with reasonable transition to what GOP has promised in terms of free market health care, or permanent irrelevance and humiliating electoral defeat. Which direction has Donald Trump charted?